Hello, everybody. I'm Morgan Hoban, and I'm the Pro-Action Coordinator with Alberta Milk. I just wanted to welcome you to the second of this week's Coffee Talk, talking about our dairy cattle health and management topic. And so just wanted to welcome you today. We have a great presentation with our featured speaker with Dr. Karen Orsel, and we also have an industry specialist who will be doing the facilitating of our question and answer period afterwards, Doug Johnstone. So there's just some housekeeping for the conversation. Afterwards, there is the opportunity to put your questions into the Q&A, which will be found on the bottom of your screen. So you can just type that in. You can type in as an anonymous participant or as yourself. So without further ado, I guess we will pass it off to Karen, and she will present on her topic today.
Thank you, Morgan. I'm just gonna share my screen and get us going here. I will put it in presentation mode. If it wants to listen to me, there we go. Okay, let me know if it's not okay. If it is, if I don't hear, I think it's good. So really, lameness again. Some people have heard me talk about it before, but for those that don't know who I am, I arrived like I was in the little bio in 2008 in Canada, and I'm happy wearing coveralls. Sometimes I wear a white coat in the lab, but nowadays, you know, really my life is pretty much on Zoom. I spend a lot of time in my office, which nowadays looks like this. But, you know, would prefer to be out on farms with, you know, either dairy calves or beef calves. So what I do is a lot of time focused on lameness. And why am I so interested in lameness? I think lameness is hugely undervalued for the cost in production, for the cost of reduced intake, for the cost of reduced fertility, and the increased risk of culling, as you know, visualized here in this little cartoon. So when I moved to Calgary to join the vet school, you know, we started a study in 2010, and we were really, you know, focusing on the dairy code of practice that says routinely observe cows for lameness and aim for a prevalence below 10%. And unfortunately, our data found that we had, on average in Canada, but also as the Blue Star identifies, about 20% of the cows obviously lame in our Alberta dairies. I always say there is a little bit of good news in average, because average is really not a very useful number. And as Laura Solano has talked about lots to some of you, is that we had people that really struggled, but we also had people that really had a handle on what was going on. And in our collaboration with hoof trimmers in Alberta, we actually tried to identify what the most common lesions were that were causing this lameness, that 20% of lameness in dairy herds. And as you can see here, our biggest challenge at that point in time was digital dermatitis in red, and in blue, the so-called non-infectious causes of lameness, sole ulcers, white line, and sole hemorrhages. But what is most important is that in our study, 98% of all the farms had digital dermatitis, and within the herd, up to 28% on average was affected by digital dermatitis. And actually our top dairy herd had 80% of the animals affected by digital dermatitis. So we really felt it was important to focus on that. And that's what we did. And in this talk, I will separate the focus on, in red, the infectious lesions, and in blue, the non-infectious lesions. And for those of you that would like to read up on this a little bit more, I think the website from Zinpro, where they, for example, introduce the first step locomotion scoring, but also have a really nice description of all the lesions, including some visuals, is very helpful. So for infectious, digital dermatitis, our biggest challenge, heel horn erosion, interdigital dermatitis, and foot rot as the most common infectious lesions. And most of the time, as risk factors or as causes, you know, we talk about anything linked to hygiene, biosecurity, foot bath management, foot bath design, environmental cleanliness. But anything that's hygiene related has an impact on infectious foot lesions. Unfortunately, sometimes we have very limited responses to treatment, and that's still one of our challenges. If I use some of my time to talk a little bit more about non-infectious lesions, and again, including the SynPro scoring guide, white lined lesions, sole ulcers, sole hemorrhages, toe ulcers, all these lesions that are not as high in prevalence or in percentages, but very often definitely a serious cause of lameness. For those kind of lesions, our focus very often is on what I summarize as trauma. So anything in stall design, anything in standing time, cows that are out of the pens for too long in waiting areas, for example, for milking, or stocking density, that cows are bullying each other away, floor slipperiness, anything like that, sharp turns, very important, all underlying, the risk for non-infectious foot lesions. But unfortunately, if you go to find the science, there is not a lot known about the exact cause. So we know very little about when these non-infectious lesions start. We know that when they occur, we link them to trauma-related issues. Unfortunately, with the data collection that some of the trimmers do, we know that a lot of animals that have non-infectious foot lesions relapse. So we don't always have a good recovery. And some really interesting work, and I will give you, quite a bit of, details from the group in Nottingham, led by John Huxley, who is currently in New Zealand. But they did some really amazing work on the non-infectious side, where our group mainly focused on the infection side. But they said, okay, loss of body condition accounts for 6% increase in lameness score. Loss of body condition, 0.5 point on hurt level, accounts for 11% of increase in very severe lameness scores. But also 9 to 21% of all lameness events were attributed to previous lamenesses occurring in the 4 months before. So if it happened in the 4 months before, 9 to 21% of those animals showed lameness within, the next, when they had a lameness event again. So a high relapse rate. So animals, might recover within a month or two, but then relapse again within 4 months. And that's a very serious issue. So Ruben Newsom looked into that a little bit more, and I'm going to show you a little bit of anatomy, and I'll visualize that in different ways. So this is a drawing of a foot of a cow, but cut in half. So what you see here is the pedal bone, P3. This line is your coronary band. This is the wall, this is the sole, and the other, 2 bones that are part of the finger of the foot of a cow. Keep this in mind for those of you that like, cartoons more than, the meat. But then again, this is a picture I got from John Huxley. Is quite nice to see. This foot is also sawed and cut into the pedal bone. And I actually have a next slide where it shows that the distal phalanx of pedal bone, P3, digital cushion, the sole horn, the wall, P2, P1, your joint, all these kind of, anatomical structures that are very important for non-infectious causes of hoof lesions. What they did is they did CT scans on slaughter animals. And these are CT scans. So here in the top, you again see your pedal bone, your P3, your P2. This is the beautiful joint here in a healthy cow. And that the edges look, relatively nice. This is the pedal bone of a cow. So this is normal on the top and large amount of new bone in the bottom. So here you see all these kind of edges. So that is irritated bone that never healed, but responded with just forming new bone tissue right there. And we now think that the formation of that new bone that we won't see because it sits in the claw, it's covered within the wall and the sole, but that is the reason why there is recurring lamenesses. because you can imagine that the underlying layer here of healthy tissue is constantly needled by all this new bone that is formed. And that might be one of the reasons that we see so many relapses. So I know a few years ago, Gerard Kramer and myself talked at the WCDS about stop creating chronically lame cows. We have to understand when this happens and to prevent that this happens, you know, and causes this, because once this is there, it will hardly ever disappear. So infectious, non-infectious causes, you know, lots of lameness in Alberta. What are we doing with all this knowledge? Well, what we did is in 2015, we went back to herds that Laura visited in 2010, 2011, and we asked people that were motivated to make changes. And the changes that they made, so they were classified as herds that made changes or no changes, were to the barn area. So either the flooring or the crossovers or anything that they changed to make it better and avoid lamenesses from happening. So we had, 28% of lameness in the herds that were willing to make changes, and 19% in the herds that did not make changes in 2015. So in 2015, visiting exactly the same herds, you can see that the herds that had very high prevalences in 2011 significantly reduced that level of lameness. So the changes they made had an impact. And also, if we compared within 2015, the group that did not make changes to the group that had made changes, that it was significantly lower. So we felt very strongly that we had evidence that if you make changes, it has an impact. So in 2018, we sent Michelle van Hoystein on farm, and we really wanted to know, like, these risk factors, these risks that the cows are exposed to, can we quantify them? Can we let the producers know, you are more at risk, you should make some changes? Unfortunately, this graph looks pretty much the same as the one from Laura Solano in 2010. But, you know, we tried to give people scores about how they were doing and how they were doing in different areas. And ultimately, our goal was to find a line like this here in the top right. If you have more of this risk, you are more likely to have a lot of lameness. Well, unfortunately, that became a little bit of a disappointing exercise, because if we linked the lameness prevalence to the risk assessment questionnaire outcomes, there wasn't that beautiful straight line under 45 degrees. It was pretty flat. And when we split that out for infectious lesions, even flatter. Or for non-infectious lesion, a little bit more steep, but still not as steep as we would like to have it. So here you can see is that we tried to provide people with a quantification, but it wasn't that easy. It's not just one thing. It's not just the environment, but it's also how animals are managed. And that is harder to capture in a risk assessment questionnaire. So we know a lot, but there's likely even more that we don't know, because we did not capture that in our risk assessment questionnaire. But moving forward, I think there is an immediate need for individual animal attention. And attention starts with detection, and ideally early detection. For now, our best method is still gait scoring. And we know that gait scoring is hard because we tend to disagree. And this is what we found in the research across Canada, is where the researchers said that on average, 22% of the animals were lame. You know, producer estimated 9%. So that's quite a difference. So we have to become better at detection of lameness, but also at treatment, have a protocol. And, you know, whether that is, you know, calling the trimmer to assist with trimming or medication, call the vet or whoever you need, but also focus on prevention, because we get a better understanding of those cows that are most at risk, and we need to avoid them becoming chronically lame and being those recurrent cows. Very recent, a paper came out from the group in the Netherlands, from the health services there, where they really reflect on, like, how do we do this? And the two things that they summarized is, we need good data, so that we know what's going on. And we need good communication about prevention. And we could not agree more. This is a paper that we recently published that was led by Marlene Knaus, and she interviewed a lot of people in Alberta, producers that were involved in many of our studies, and we asked them, what do you think? What do you think is the barrier? Where do you struggle? What works? What doesn't work? And the people that she identified, like I said, this is the whole group that was participating in Michelle's study. We picked extremes. So people that have high prevalence and high scores. So they were top right in my scatter plot. Low prevalence, low risk assessment. Those are the perfect ones at the bottom left in my scatter plot. But also people that score high or low, and that doesn't really link so well together, and people that are somewhere in the middle. You know, the scores weren't perfect, the lameness wasn't perfect, but that seems to be our average. And Marlene spent quite a bit of time, you know, interviewing people and asking them about their perceptions, their identified barriers, their feelings, like, what do you think? What do you want? What do you need? And these are the 5 themes that we identified as being the most important after talking to people of all kind of different success rates. Theme 1 was identifying lameness is still a challenge. You know, some people called it barn blinding, and I found that a really nice word because, you know, if you see cows walking lame, at a certain point, you don't even notice it anymore. It's only that 3-legged lame animal that yells at you, but it's not that cow that scores a lameness score 3 or maybe even a 2, which is part of your early detection mechanism. Or some people just said, you know, I just don't know how to do it. I find it hard. I find it difficult. I don't have the tools for detection, let alone early detection. Theme 2 was the responsibility for lameness prevention and control. And most producers agreed that it was their responsibility, but they really felt, you know, challenged with taking that responsibility because success is not immediate and hard to measure. Although I showed you, you know, some contrasting and very positive results that Emily Morabito was able to identify when she went back to herds that made changes, but there was at least a 4-year gap in between. And a lot of times when we make investments in changes, we want those investments to pay off right away. But if your cows already have those bony changes, those payoffs might just not come until years later. Theme 4 was the decision-making for and against lameness prevention control. And I think that might be where we ended up, you know, having a lot of discussions because we never tell you the one thing that you have to do. There is always a huge list of things that you can do, and you have to pick and choose, you know, which ones you think will have the most impact. Because most people cannot do everything, but it's hard to decide on what should be prioritized. And then on top of that, even if, let's say, I would be very strong about, you know, one thing that should always be prioritized, one size does not fit all. And what do I mean with that? Every producer is different. Every farm is different. Every goal for the individual dairy farmer is different. And we have to recognize that. Because some people that, you know, we identified them as personality themes, you know, they were overwhelmed. You know, they've tried to address lameness. It was so hard, it's so complex, and they just felt overwhelmed and they kind of accept that it is where it's at. And some people were just clearly like, you know, I have more things on my mind than just lameness to worry about. Some people are super keen, they're eager, they're on the ball, they got it all sorted. Other really said, well, it depends on, you know, if my labor, my, you know, other people that are involved with farm management, what is being prioritized. And I understand that too, because you have to have a little bit of a passion for lameness to be on the ball, because it is time consuming, it is not easy, etc. We also have to recognize that some people are transitioning. And, you know, I think there's been reports on the average age of the dairy farmer. So with transitioning, who decides on the priorities and where do the priorities lies and where do the investments go? And a lot of people, unfortunately, end up being the convenient. It better be easy. And otherwise, you know what? I'm just not going to do it. So when we presented this data to dairy veterinarians in Alberta in a communication study, we really tried to work with them to understand how personalities can be different and how you have to adjust your communication methods to be really effectively communicating to help people, getting that handle on lameness prevention and control. So I'm trying to wrap up because I noticed I'm going a little bit over time. Where are we now? I think where we are is that many producers have become the convenient type. They wait for the magic bullet, and if the magic bullet comes out, they might be buying in, but they're not on the ball. They think it's too complicated, too time or money consuming, and they just accept where it's at. So I feel we've lost a little bit of momentum to really make changes, although we've shown that changes make a difference, but it hasn't resulted in a lot of progress in the last 15 years. At least that's the time that I've been in Alberta and I can reflect on. So where do you want it to go? It's up to the industry to decide where you want it to go. Do you want to focus on the limited understanding we have about the origin of non-infectious lesions? Like, where do they occur? When does it start? When do interventions still be effective? Or what kind of early diagnostic tools can we develop to help you, be on the ball earlier on and not waiting till a cow has a toe ulcer and becomes your chronic lame cow that needs to be trimmed pretty much every 4 or 6 months. Limited understanding why therapeutics or other interventions in infectious lesions often don't work. We focus a lot at the moment on the microbiome, so understanding more about all the bacteria that are involved. But how do we treat most effectively, or what is most important? That is still an open question. And then just to finish off with that last component that Marlena focused on, talking to producers and talking to veterinarians, is that producers need help and support. They need help and support that is relevant to their environment, their goals, their current standards. But ultimately, producers need to have patience, because if you're in it for the long haul. I might have missed a lot of gaps in knowledge, and I'm happy if other people add them to the discussion, but I don't want to end up where, before acknowledging, funders, that I couldn't list all participants. Like, nothing happens without, trimmers and dairy farmers in the province and my collaborators in the research field. So I'll leave it there. I will stop sharing my screen, and I hope that there is a lot of comments, discussions, or disagreement with what I just presented.
Thank you very much, Karen. So now we'll have our opportunities for questions from the participants. So we'll just give Doug a chance to get his video started, as well as unmute himself. So Doug Johnstone will be our facilitator for this Q&A session. So as put in the chat, if you have a question, you can put it into the Q&A box, which you'll be able to see. You can also put it into the chat that will go to the hosts and panelists, as well as you can raise your hand using the function, and then you'll be asked to unmute yourself to ask your questions. So Doug, I'll pass it off to you.
Okay. Hey, Karen, great presentation. It was awesome. And that is as per usual. There's a lot of things that you said about changes being made. Now, the one group of producers that made the changes, and then you showed the changes that they worked, and then the other group that didn't make the changes, actually the risk factors increased. Now, what did they do about their results after they saw the good positive results from the other group? Did they make any changes?
That would have been interesting. Yeah, we didn't go back to the herd. So that was Emily Morabito's study. So after we presented to them, what we hoped that the impact would be is that if we show evidence that it works, that people would be motivated to make those changes. But when we went back to the big, large group of farms that Laura Solano went back to in 10, you could see in that risk assessment scatter plot, it was all over the map. So unfortunately, it didn't have an impact that people bought in to, these changes make sense. And that's why we decided to figure out, why do people not do it?
Well,
and yeah.
Sorry. You carry on.
Oh, try to stop me. I can talk for an hour, but I shouldn't. You know, I have a favorite sentence, and I think you need to have enough gray hair and been there for longer
I've
to
got
acknowledge it.
got
But
lots of gray hair.
my one sentence now is knowledge does not change behavior. And
Okay,
I think we know a lot. I think we can tell producers, if you do A, then B. That's the knowledge that we pass on. But that doesn't change how people feel. How people, feel that they're getting in the driver's seat and getting a handle on dealing with locomotion issues, with lameness issues, etc. So that's I think one of the biggest challenge. We tend to throw knowledge at people, but I don't know if knowledge is changing what we're doing on a daily basis, because people have to change what they've done for years, what they've done for 10 years, for 20 years, or whatever.
well, I know the big thing I come across is, well, my grandfather didn't do this, and my father didn't do this, so why should I do it? But it seems to me that these changes work, but myself as a producer, I'm looking at these changes, and these changes all cost money, and my profit lines are, at least in the Fraser Valley, the word that I'm getting is that I don't have the cash available to make these changes. So can there be any government intervention with money or anything like that? Like, where do we get the cash to do these changes? We know that they're going to work, but where does the cash come from?
I think ultimately the cash comes from, reduced culling and increased production, and just having better repro, etc. So the cost comes from within, but it will be in the long term, right? Because I think if we're looking at culling rates, they're very high in North America, especially if you compare it to other parts of the world. We cull a lot of animals. We cull them before they made up for the time that we raised them and they were not giving us anything back. So we need to have them in the herd for up to 2 lactations, preferably 3, before they make you money. Most of them, they were losing them, before the end of the second lactation. That's where your money comes from. Unfortunately, it means that I don't have a bag of money for you sitting there to make investments and change the flooring or change the stalls, or, add on a new barn because your stocking density is too high. And that's really the challenge. You're losing money. You're sort of, the tap's open, but you need money to close the tap.
Yeah, no, like I say, I just put my producer hat on at that point and said, where's the cash going to come from? You made another comment at one point about stall or cubicle design. And if it's one thing that I notice all the time, that it's constantly changing. And then each supplier of stalls, and I'm going to put this back in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, the stall design between suppliers is different. So, who's the expert here and who isn't?
Yeah. I think I've seen a stall that if I showed you the measurements, you could not believe that a dairy cow in Alberta could be happy. But the lameness was very low. There were no lesions on the hocks or the knees. The animals did amazing. And what we're often not measuring is management. So if there is poor stall design, unfortunately, blame granddad or your dad or whoever decided on stalls that were put in 20 years ago and they're just not up to current standards. Sometimes you can manage them well. Can you bet them with more bedding? Can you just make it easier for the cows? Can you make the life for heifers different? Can you make a heifer group to make it easier for the heifers? Can you protect your animals that are most at risk by making a fresh cow group that has access to, the better part of the stalls, etc. So the management, some people are managing like poor stall design to such an extent that they're doing really well. So I think if you're thinking about what's the best, go talk to people. I personally still think that, the farm visits that we do with the Western Canadian Dairy Seminar are super helpful, because then you see how people make it work. And are you willing to put in that same time and energy to make it work, or are you a different type of person?
Yeah.
I don't think there is a magic bullet.
Well, one thing I have tried when I do my computer printout, at the end of the day, it shows the cost of lameness. And so what I did it with Monopoly money, actually, is there was a $10,000 cost of lameness. So I handed the guy $10,000 in Monopoly money. And then I said, well, if we can reduce your incidence of digital dermatitis, then in half, I'm going to give you 5,000 more dollars. Or if it doubled, I would take money away. But it was very visible.
Yeah.
And that was how I got my point across, albeit it was Monopoly money, but that's all the money that these guys are losing is out in La La Land.
Yep.
Well, how do we make it more visible for them? Like, do we literally take cash out of their pockets?
Well, I think, you know, that's again comes back to my favorite sentence, knowledge doesn't change behavior. There is enough evidence that it costs money. So if people, you know, buy into that knowledge, it's there, but, you know, they don't feel it. So when do you feel it? Well, ProAction tries to move a little bit in that direction and tells you, like, you know, certain, you know, severely lame animals are just not acceptable. But I also know the industry really doesn't want to go to an area where we're penalizing people for, you know, having too much lameness.
Well,
But
that'd
on the other hand, we also don't, you know, hand out the monopoly money to the people that do really well.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
at the moment, the incentive has to come from within. And that's, you know, we've seen some people that what we call the eager types, you know, they just don't want to deal with lameness. They just don't want to lose the cows because they become chronically lame, you know, in their second lactation and are just not being rebred because they cannot handle their stall environment.
I've got a question here, Karen, from one of the participants. It's to both you and I. Should farm employees have a gait scoring course to help identify lameness?
What do you think, Doug?
I'll go out on a limb here and say absolutely. But I don't think that farmers should be gait scoring the cows themselves on a regular basis. To identify lameness, yes. But I actually think an outside source should come in and do it. The UK, they have the foot trimmer come in before the designated visit, and he gait scores the cows, compares his list to the farmer's list that he's made up, and makes any additions or subtractions. What do you think about that process? That's going to cost more money again.
The interesting thing is, and you know, that's why I love my job working at the university with, and especially with students from all over the planet, because for those of you that have met Marlena, she comes from, you know, a background in Europe where actually veterinarians have that power and tell you, you have to do something. This cow, and you know, next time when I come, it better be solved. So that's a totally different, you know, environment. And that's an environment that's just doesn't fit with the Canadian culture. However, do I think it helps if people get tools in their hand to identify? Sure, but I'm spending every day on farm if you want, if you promise me to do something with it. Because I think a lot of time people see lame cows and they're like, yeah, so many are lame. And then what? They call you as a hoof trimmer. And when do you come? 2 months later? I want a plan. What are you going to do with those numbers? Are you going to respond to it? Are you willing to react to whatever we find? I think that's the only way to move forward.
Okay, well, I've got Albert's right behind me here. He must be dying to ask a question because he's generally full of them. So what do you have to say, Albert? Oh, he's got a paper here, Karen. You're in big trouble.
He wrote down a lot of questions. Where do you disagree with me, Albert? Come on, give me a hard time.
I'm not disagreeing at all. You're talking about changes. And the word changes are very vague. Did you find in that research study one change that made the biggest difference? And yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on what the changes really are?
Sure. So what Emily did is she really contacted everyone that was participating in Laura's study and asked them, the questions that we had in a questionnaire in Laura's study, and asked them the same questions again to see if they scored the same. For, did they do anything with stall design, with bedding, with flooring, anything and everything. Unfortunately, the changes were so varied, like everyone did something, that we had to group them. And the results that I showed you from Emily's study were really people that made changes to the stall environment. So the flooring, or the crossovers, they put rubber on the crossovers, they changed the stalls. So anything in the environment, not something that is management. So, what people would do, like scraping frequency or things like that. So they were all like environmentally focused. And I do see in the Q&A some comment about, what works in your neighbor's farm might not always work in your own barn. And I think that is a very true comment, because there's a lot of things that you do, but very often if people make changes to, let's say you put rubber in the crossovers, but is that also the area where it's too narrow and cows have issues with passing each other? Is that also the area where there is the water trough and there is a little bit of, kerfuffle around that area? How do you clean it? Are you manually cleaning that area, or is there an automatic scraper that is just in the alleyways and the crossovers don't get cleaned? All these things add up. So I think I would challenge you, Albert, you and I cannot design the perfect stall without lameness. Because we can build a perfect stall, but if we put a poor herdsman on there, we will get lameness, even in a perfect environment, because it's the animals, it's the environment, and it's the people, the management. And those three things always go together.
Okay, I've got some questions here, Karen. The first one again here is from Hendrik de Geer. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I do the G for you, the Gier.
Okay, sorry. Like stinkpot. Karen, you showed non-infectious hoof damage by trauma, but I thought it also has a lot to do with nutrition like acidosis. Is this not the science anymore?
Yeah, if John Huxley was here, he would be so happy and he would be jumping around. I think to me, it's something from the past. And I really don't support that idea anymore. Is there a role of nutrition? Of course, because we just talked about multi, factorial. Everything and anything plays a role. The only thing that we hardcore identified is that loss of body condition is linked to the thickness of the digital cushion. And that affects, the impact of trauma. So if a cow is walking on, uneven concrete and there is hardly any padding, that digital cushion went thinner, that will definitely have an impact. But it's not as much as linked to acidosis as we think. Even for foundering, think about all our beef cattle. They all have subclinical acidosis all the time. And they don't all have lameness, they don't all founder. So I would be happy if you remember from this talk, it's from the past, and that's black and white. And if you want the gray version, yes, nutrition has a little bit of impact because of the link with loss of body condition, especially in our fresh cow. So there is still a link, but it's not the acidosis link.
I'm unmuting. Okay, I'm getting the Zoom thing down. Carrie's hitting me on the head and it's working. In your research that you have conducted, this is another question from an anonymous individual. Did most these farms, most or all of them trim the cows at least twice a year?
Yes, because what was very important for us that we had the data on the lesions. So we would go in and collect data on lameness, but we did not have the data on lesions. And that's where people like yourself, I see you have your lovely Wichita shirt
Yes.
on.
Yes, I'm
The
in
cer-
instruction mode today.
Yeah, so certified hoof trimmers were essential for all our research because they collect the data according to, what we all agree on, the ICAR method. You guys have, computer systems, you collect your data, and that's data that we needed. So everyone enrolled in our study needed to have that relationship with one of you guys, with a certified hoof trimmer that's collecting data. Some had, herd trims that was, roughly 2 times a year. Some people were on a partial herd trim. Albert helped me out. Every 2 months, every 3 months is sort of, a partial hoof trim frequency. It varied a little bit depending on herd size.
Well, the goal still being every cow being trimmed twice a year.
Agreed.
Whether that was done all at once or whether that was done in 4 or 5 visits.
I think what is the advantage, and that what we try to show in an economic analysis that Marlena also did, is that if you guys come out more frequently, there is more opportunity to trim cows that are, just getting lame or were lame and needed to be looked at again 3 months later. So we're having a better handle on intervention.
I've got another question that just popped up here, Karen, and it's interesting. What about in the herds that you did you have less lameness in herds with a higher butterfat content, or did you not look at anything like that?
We have not linked it to, we did link it to production. We didn't link it to butterfat. Yeah. So that wasn't, so let's brainstorm. What do we think? Because now we're going back to that, nutrition underlying cause of lameness. Is that, what would you expect? Is it just high, or is it the inverted ones that are worrying us?
Well, the inverted ones worry me because that's when I've seen the most lameness. To me, and I'm just looking at this simply, I'm not a nutritionist, but the guys who are feeding a lot of hay, for instance, just free choice hay, the clients that I deal with have the least amount of lameness. And their fat is also higher. So that works for me.
Yeah. And, sometimes there's evidence that is out there that is just, it works for your neighbor and it works really well. I think the scientific evidence that is, most convincing for me is the body condition. Whatever you can do to keep the body condition on the cows, that is essential. And that indirectly, of course, is linked to body fat.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, for sure. I've had another one pop up here. It's pretty cool. It's for both you and myself. Considering a preventative approach to lameness, does cow conformation breeding choices affect prevalence of lameness? If so, what traits should be considered? For example, heel depth, etc. Do you want me to repeat that?
Nope. No, I get it. Do you want to start answering it, Doug? What's your idea?
Well, I definitely think that you have to take that into consideration. Like just because your best cow in your herd that gives you the most milk might also be going lame more often than the other cow. So I would say, yeah, don't flush her. Flush the cow that's maybe giving 10% less milk and sees the hoof trimmer twice a year, and you don't have to deal with anything other than trimming her.
Yeah,
I would say that's a very viable choice.
Yeah, I think, and we're living, I live in my basement nowadays, but there's good things to that as well, because there is active groups on Facebook and on Twitter, and especially in the UK, there's a really vibrant, researcher, trimmer, dairy environment where people have these discussions. And I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, but since John Huxley moved to New Zealand, George O took over.
Okay.
Can you try it?
No, I'm not going to try.
Oika something.
Yeah,
I'm not trying. But if you follow them, and he was challenged with exactly this question, where how can we breed our way out of lameness? And that is a question, and I see Albert saying, no. I agree with Albert. It's part of the puzzle. And if I do presentations, I often have a jigsaw puzzle in there. It's a piece of the puzzle. There is genetic correlations with lesions, you know, and there is papers that showed us that heritability is not super high, but it adds, it helps. So it's a piece of the puzzle. So can you breed your way out? I don't think so. Can it help? Can you make choices that are better for foot health? Oh, yes, you can. It's
Definitely.
confirmation, it's, you know, it's the heritability of lesions, or breed, you know?
Now, do
Instead
you
of those
find,
beautiful white belly ladies, if you put jerseys there, you know, you are out of a job, Doug.
well, yeah, well, that's just it. Like, let's take, for example, heel depth.
Yeah.
Like those little brown devils
Yeah.
have no heel as a rule. But yet the lameness is minimal.
Yeah.
But all we talk about when we've got the classifier out is heel depth.
And we know it plays a role. We know it's part of that whole, you know, function of the hoof, and also in infectious lesions, you know, how easy that area can be sort of cleaned out. Because you know, we talked about what works with the neighbor and what doesn't work here. Well, if you have very dirty feet, because the barn environment is dirty and cows have a lot of accumulated, you know, slurry on their feet, they can walk through footbaths forever, but it won't work. And so that's where heel depth is often brought in, as in it will protect that heel area a little bit better from infectious diseases. And I think it all is valid. It's all part of the solution. But I agree, you cannot breed your way out of lameness,
Can
but
we
you can
talk
definitely
everybody
make better
into,
choices.
can we talk everybody into jumping into jerseys? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either. But I do know that you know, there is besides, you know, the heritability of the lesions, there is breed effects. It's proven. It's there.
High concentration diets. Yeah, we're all laughing at that one.
Yeah.
Is it going to be, are we going to have more lameness by feeding them or less lameness?
I don't think it matters. All, you know, I told you I do beef and dairy cattle. All my beef cattle are on the highest grain diets that you can imagine, and they're not lame. So
And I've got another individual, another anonymous individual. We see in our own herd, if we can keep our fat above 3.9, we see a lot less lameness.
a lot less.
4 to 5 pounds of grass hay in their diet. It has made quite a difference here. And I think we've already touched on that.
Yeah.
The hay, the higher fat, they're chewing more. We got better quality horn being produced. So I definitely think that's the one. Now we're talking about human factors here. This is going to get tough. I'm not a philosopher. I actually score very low on the empathy scale.
Come on, I don't believe that one.
No, I do. I'm probably a negative thing. You indicated the human factors are also very important regarding lameness prevalence on a farm. What do you think is the role of social science in this, if any? And how does social science compare to another experimental study on lameness? Do you want me to? That's a tough one.
Well, but I think it's sort of, you know, shows where my current dairy lameness has ended. That has ended with social science, because I'm getting so convinced that knowledge is not changing behavior. I have to understand how I can change behavior. And that is why we did our interviews that Marlena led on. So what is it that producers struggle with? What is it that producers want from us, from research, from anyone that is consulting on their farm? And then also talking to veterinarians, like, can we give them different tools in communicating these things to, you know, they're complex. Lameness is not simple. There's never one thing that you can change. We always try to make, you know, do these 5 things, and no, that's not how simple it is. But how do you communicate those complex things effectively? Can we provide, you know, veterinarians or any other, you know, consultant on farm with communication training to be
Monopoly money. Provide them with monopoly money.
Yeah, but that is how it works, right? Is it, focus groups that we are, seeing what the neighbor does and what we think works and why not, and what would work with you. Like, I totally think that a lot of the hardcore science where I started is ending up, is bringing those components in, because what we haven't touched upon, and that's sort of where I left it with my presentation, is that currently we seem to be at, a standstill. On average, 20% of the cows is lame. Lameness is identified in the top 1 to 3 of importance, in the top 1 to 3 of reasons for culling. So we all agree it's important. We all agree it costs money. We all agree it's there. But now what?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't see any movement. I don't see it going anywhere.
That's the tough one. That is the tough one. I mean, I've been beating a drum for just about 28 years. My single focus, though, is on lameness.
Yep.
Now, the dairy farmer has got to deal with 10 other issues.
Yep.
I mean, that's a tough job. I mean, they're worried about reproduction. They're worried about production. They're worried about the crops that are in their field, whether they're going to get them on or off or not. They're worried about the roof falling in because it needs to be replaced. I mean, talking about multifactorial thinking, those guys don't have an easy job.
No, I totally agree. And that's where you have to set priorities. And I think lameness, if I look at culling reasons, the number one is always, udder or production. But I think, a cow is lame and it's identified as lame, but ultimately, you pull the trigger when also it has an impact on production. And then she's leaving the herd because of production on paper. But I think it's because of lameness, because she's lame. She managed, and at a certain point she can't manage anymore. Her production goes down and she's leaving because of production.
Yeah, those figures are definitely skewed.
Yeah.
They're definitely more directly linked to lameness than, because it's the underlying factor that's causing these problems. Well,
and I know we're starting to run out of time, but where the industry is not necessarily interested in going, but that was a little bit of a motivator in 2010, I know for sure, is the word animal welfare. And then again, I will use my mom again. I always say, if my mom comes on farm and you have something to hide from her, it's a problem. So, is 20% lameness? That's not a number to be proud of.
No.
So, the driver, and I know that we cannot say that, the public opinion or the consumer, because it's a shit show if we start talking about that, but it is a reality. The modern generations makes decisions, and, we better respond.
Oh, no, it's not easy. I have my complete sympathy. But they do.
Nobody ever said it was easy. Isn't that?
Well, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it.
Yeah.
But I think to get the guys to move, there's got to be more of a motivational factor. But finding that factor is the tough one. Yep. I unfortunately haven't discovered it other than plying an individual with liquor.
And play Monopoly on farm.
I'm gonna
do that one day. And then I'm going to give them the 10,000 and I'll ask them, okay, if you can invest this money, where would it go? Because that would be a fun exercise to see, if you can set priorities, where should we set the priority?
I think it would go into Bitcoin.
Or in their next holiday to Mexico. Oh, you can go 10 times probably.
Yes. Well, I can imagine you're not having a lot of fun in your basement.
Oh, I'm having so much fun here. I'm laughing out loud.
What is going to happen when you have to go into the real world again?
I don't know. I don't know if I can do it again. I don't know how to do it anymore.
How are we going to motivate that change?
Well, and it's hard because, I've stayed healthy and I want to stay healthy. So maybe I'll stay in my basement.
Well, that would be an absolute shame.
Well, if you invite me on farm, Doug, I will come. Just invite
me. Okay. I will do that. Thank you so much, Karen. I mean, I found it extremely informative. And once again, I've enjoyed chatting with you. It's very nice to see you.
Yeah.
And I hope to see you out in the real world soon. I'll even wear a mask.
Perfect. Well, we'll leave it at that. So I'd just like to thank Dr. Karen Orsel again for a wonderful presentation. It really highlighted that lameness really is multifactorial, right? When it's at the farmer level, the cow level, the facility level, and really is that puzzle that she was mentioning. So it's trying to find what works for individual farms and how we can move forward on this potential or this particular area. So I also like to thank Doug for facilitating the question and answer. That was great, wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'd also like just to thank all the participants for joining us today. We will send all today's registrants a link to this recording of this coffee talk and then any of the relevant research papers to the topic of lameness. And we also will have a survey that we'd like the participants to fill out. The feedback will be really instrumental in helping us to improve these types of sessions and any of our other DRECA extension activities. And so we have one more coffee talk coming this week. Tomorrow will be Dr. Herman Barkema, and he'll be presenting on the antimicrobial use and resistance in the dairy industry. So we're hoping that many of you will be able to join us again tomorrow. So with that, I'd like to say thanks again to everyone and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again for coming.